What's up everyone, Nader here. In this video, what I'd like to do is go over an introduction to events in the browser DOM together. This is going to be actually kind of a two-part mini series of videos where we're going to do an intro in this video with a bunch of exercises, and then in the next set of videos we're going to go over kind of this idea of bubbling and event capturing and event delegation to be a bit more advanced with this concept of events. So in this video we're going to go over just generally what are events, a little bit of kind of the nomenclature behind events, and some analogies, as well as kind of what this idea of event listeners actually are in the browser so we can start using them together to add some functionality to our apps that we weren't able to before. Let's get right into it. All right, so to start, I just kind of want to go over a quick kind of overview of what these idea of events are and just some of the kind of naming around these that you might see thrown around as you study this concept. So events actually in JavaScript are super central to the language. Interestingly, events, JavaScript actually is really what's called, for the most part, an event-based programming paradigm or language. It can do things like object-oriented programming, which is another paradigm, functional programming, which is another paradigm. But really, if you look at the JavaScript engines behind the scenes, as well as this idea of how JavaScript is really single-threaded, if you heard that before, instead of multi-threaded like other languages, it really relies on this thing called the event loop in the engine and just events in general to kind of make things happen quickly instead of having to rely on this idea of multiple threads. So without going too deep in this idea of what events are versus threads, since that kind of gets into the realm of a bit more computer science and the internal workings of the things like engines, which I would love to make videos about in the future. For now, let's just focus on this idea of events. I just want to bring up this term, event-based programming, because it is really important and central to the language of JavaScript specifically, as well as a few other types of languages where you can use this idea of events to kind of simulate something very similar. For example, the C# language or .NET and things like Unity, which are used for game development, use event-based programming quite a lot to actually signal different things that are happening in the program or game back and forth very easily between code. Now, when we come to events, we're not going to cover this probably in this series, since this is actually very similar to what we're going to learn right now when we come into events, but there is this idea of also custom events. So I just want to keep this at the back of our minds as we're going through events in JavaScript together in this video, because we can actually create our own custom events. We're not actually limited to the ones that are in the browser. And this is super important when we're actually working on events, for example, on the backend or in other areas that are not in the browser. So this idea of events is actually central to JavaScript, not specifically to the browser. We're going to be using events in the browser in this video using elements and the events attached to those elements like paragraphs and buttons and things like that. But events actually can be used anywhere. It's just a way to signal that something happened, which I'll get to shortly. So as mentioned, we're going to go over this central idea for this particular video. Since we're going over this idea of the DOM, we can actually create DOMs on the backend as well, as I mentioned, especially in other languages that are not JavaScript based. But the idea of event-based programming still kind of applies to those ideas where we're actually attaching these events to different DOM nodes using some of the APIs that we're going to look at shortly. So those two APIs, what we're going to look at for browser and for elements specifically in the DOM, are this idea of the on and then something elements or event listeners, for example, on click or on mouse move. We're going to see a bunch of these, and I'm actually going to show us a reference list to actually get some examples of what kind of cool stuff we can do with these events that are built into the browser, and this idea of just event listeners in general as well. You might have heard this before. Event listeners is generally like a more general idea of what these events are, and this idea of listeners I'm going to kind of get to shortly when I see the analogy, so we can actually make more sense of like, what are we listening for? What are we hearing or listening to, right? So just keep these in mind. We're going to really go over this idea of this on attributes and then the event listeners in general, which is a separate API from the actual HTML one that we're going to look at in a second. So let's just zoom out for a second before we zoom in and take a look at an analogy. So I hope you like this drawing that I put together. I spent a lot of time putting this together. I didn't actually draw these. I got these from some kind of open source stock images. I wish I could draw these. They're pretty pretty in my opinion. But I'm just gonna lay out a little story for you right here. So let's imagine that we have a castle or a kingdom. Okay, and we're kind of like the king or the queen of this this castle, right? So we're kind of presiding over this castle. and this kingdom of different people in there. And imagine that there's a lot of people who maybe want to come and attack our kingdom, right? They want to kind of take the resources, take some money, take some gold and treasure, whatever it happens to be, right? Maybe we're a particularly wealthy kingdom. So back in the day, what used to happen was there was this idea of like different watchtowers. Right? So you would have kind of watchtowers both in the castle and outside, located at different kind of areas. And before we had things like networks and cell phones and the internet and all that kind of stuff, we had to figure out a way to kind of pass messages or signal that something happened over long distances, right? So if you imagine, let's say you're in the medieval times and you didn't have internet or technology and all this kind of stuff, how would you actually tell someone all the way over here, let's say this is like kilometers or miles away, that something happened over where you are, right? Well, you're probably thinking, okay, well, maybe a flare, right? But there were no flares back then. We didn't really have any of that stuff. So the next best thing was to actually light a fire, right? Like a smoke signal. That's where that term comes from. So generally, what you could technically do is maybe figure out a way to actually, make more smoke or less smoke, or even color the smokes in different ways if you were able to. So imagine that we have like 3 watchtowers set up, right, in this example. And over here, we have someone watching these watchtowers for any type of signal that might happen. So let's imagine that you have like a kind of a grayish, blackish, smoky kind of signal. Maybe that is something like a medical signal, for example. I'm just making this up, right? Like this is maybe like, oh, we need medical attention. Please send the doctor over here. Like something happened to one of the people kind of in this watchtower or in the town over here that it's near. Big city over here or big castle, please send over a doctor to help us out as soon as possible, right? So instead of like maybe sending a horse, someone on horseback there and back to send that message, or a pigeon or something like that, we would use a smoke signal, and maybe the message is a bit faster because the speed of light is quite fast, right? So imagine a regular fire over here, for example. Maybe that means, like, for example, let's say that might mean that there's a potential danger ahead, right? I guess that the colors would probably be reversed for this, but let's just say that for this color is like, oh, I noticed that someone is approaching this little watchtower, or this town, or there's like a band of people kind of coming by. And I'm not really sure what they're trying to do, but this is just like a warning signal. Right? Like be watchful. Something might happen here. Maybe I'll change my signal later on. Right? And maybe over here, this blue signal, however you might manage that, is like, oh, like maybe something really bad happens, right? Like maybe these people are attacking us. Like we're going to retreat, like start preparing kind of some barricades and get the army ready and all that kind of stuff, right? So the point of all this is that really, if you boil this idea down, what we're doing is we're sending signals to different parts of this system so that they can kind of talk to each other and they can understand each other no matter really where they are, right? So these kind of watchtowers are really far away from each other, and they're also really far away from this main castle, right? So we can actually communicate really easily between these using these different colors and smoke signals, which is pretty cool, right? The speed of light, so we can see something really far away almost instantly, right? So much more efficient, very, very quick. The reason I wanted to show you this is that this is actually quite a nice analogy for how events actually work in pretty much any eventing system, and especially the eventing system we're going to look at right now in the browser DOM specifically. So the way that this is going to work is you can imagine that maybe like this castle, if you were to flip the analogy back to the browser, is like the browser or the HTML page. And all of these watchtowers are different elements on that page. What we can do is we can have the events fire off signals on those elements and communicate to other elements as well as to the browser and the actual window itself back and forth, right? Which is super, super cool. So we can actually send these signals from wherever at any point in time, as many times as we want, to actually send information and communicate that something interesting happened, which is where the word event comes from. All right. So what are these kinds of events? So let's take a look at a couple of examples. So In the browser specifically, there might be such events like the mouse and keyboard events, right? Maybe we click something, or we type in an input box, or we press one of the keys, right? Or maybe we move our mouse or scroll our mouse, right? All different types of events can happen as a result, and each of them is treated differently. Same with touch events, right? These days, mobile devices, iPads, iPhones, Android devices, even like maybe a car, right, has a touch screen in it. Those are touch events, right? So when we tap on something or we scroll up and down or something with our fingers, that might be treated differently potentially than something like a mouse, right? Because it's literally a finger in that case. It's not a mouse that's being used as the input. There's form and input events, which are slightly different. There's window and document events as well. In fact, there's events kind of everywhere, right? There's literally almost an event for almost everything. I kind of want to show you how far this idea of event actually goes by actually pulling up the documentation for events. So I'm just going to go to Google here. I'm just going to search for DOM events, right? And I want to go to the event reference here by Mozilla at MDN. So if I click on that, I'm going to zoom in a little bit here so we can see. This is the event reference, and if we you can kind of read about it here. They really have some pretty good language to kind of describe that. But here's this list of events. So we have like animations, clipboard events, CSS events, database, DOM mutation, drag and drop, blah, 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 like a whole bunch of stuff, right? And if we scroll down, you can look how long this list is, right? That's crazy. And here are all these different events like dragging and dropping, pointers, touch events, different like composition, CSS events, clipboard events. It's just a whole, like, look at this list. Right? That is totally wild. A whole bunch of fun events that we can use. Definitely not something that we can memorize, right? In fact, this list actually gets added to over time as the browser spec changes, and we can have more new types of APIs available to us that maybe weren't available before. So not something you want to memorize, definitely something you're going to come to as a reference when you need it. And you need to do that thing. So for example, maybe at some point when you're building a web app, you want to build something with the clipboard and you want to be notified when the user using your site is trying to copy or paste something. That is an event that we can actually capture and take advantage of and actually react to dynamically, which is super awesome. So just keep that at the back of your mind. A lot of events here. Kind of scroll through this when you have a chance, just for fun, to look at all the cool stuff that you can do with events. But let's kind of come back to our slides here to actually see what this really looks like in code. So the first thing I want to show you is kind of the way that you'll see events done most of the time when you're first starting. This is actually also the way that events are done in other frameworks such as React, which we're going to see in the next series. They prefer to use these kinds of events as opposed to the other one I'm going to show you next. But it really is important to learn both of these eventing styles because you can actually do different things with each of them. So in this case, this is the kind of on, and then I put a star event listener. So let's take a look at how this works. So up top here, I have a button element, right? And I have an attribute called onClick, right? So notice that there's no dash, there's no camel casing here. It's just onClick, all lowercase, all one word, right? So on and then the name of the event usually is how this works, at least when it comes to these attribute names in the actual HTML itself. So what these are attributes that are special reserved attributes in the browser DOM. What this is telling this element and the browser to do is that when this element is clicked in this case, because that's the event we're referencing, then I would like you, browser, to execute this JavaScript code in these braces over here, right? Or in these quotes, I should say, right? So we're saying when you click this button, then console log meow. That's the code that we want to execute when we have this event run. So in English, what this means in plain English is like when we click the button that says click me, it's going to find if there is an event handler, which in this case there is, which is this one right here, the onClick. And it's going to run the code inside of these two quotations, which is going to console log to our console, meow. Okay, so this is the attribute, and then this is the attribute value, which is the code to actually run. So let's take a look at this before we go further on the slide, just to see how this works. I'm going to pull up VS Code here. I'm going to create a new file, and I'm just going to call this events.html. Okay, so in here, I'm going to create my doc type of HTML. I'm going to create my head, and here I'm going to create my title. I'm going to call this events, and then I actually forgot to do HTML. I should probably do that first. There we go. Got too excited. I'm going to paste this down here. I'm going to put a body in here, and inside the body, I'm going to put some code. So in here, let's just go with this simple example. I'm going to have a button. It's going to say click me in it, right? A regular button. So if I right click this events.html and I say reveal in Finder, and I'm nice and zoomed in here, hopefully you can see events.html. I double click on this to open it in my browser. We'll see a little button here. Let me super zoom in so we can actually see that. I'm going to open up my console here on the right, and all I have here is this button that says click me, right? And if I open up my console and I click this button, absolutely nothing happens, which makes sense because we didn't actually tell it to do anything. All it says is click me on it. So if I scroll back here to VS Code, now what I want to do is I want to say on click, right? And this is a special attribute that is telling the browser to attach a function, or a bunch of code in this case, to this event if it fires from this particular element. So what do I want to do? In here, I want to do console.log, and I want to say meow. Right, now just be careful with the quotes here. I have double quotes out here, single quotes in here, just to get your quotes correct so that you don't end up accidentally escaping the quotes. Make sure that you do double quotes on the outside and single quotes on the inside like that. Okay, now let me come back to my browser here. I'm going to reload the page, right? And now if I click this button, let's see what happens. Right, we get a meow logged out. And I click on this, you can see we get many meows logged out. And if I go back to my Elements tab, you'll see that now there's an on-click attribute with a console log of meow in there, which makes sense, right? So this is saying that we have an event that's going to run an on-click event, and it's going to, in this case, run the console log. Now, just to show you that this is going to run any code, if I do a semicolon here and I do console.log of hello, right? And I save this is just going to get formatted down here. This is effectively 2 lines of code. This is not something we're going to be doing, by the way, just for demo purposes right now. We're actually going to refer to a function later so that we don't have a bunch of random JavaScript inside our HTML, because that looks a little bit messy. We're just going to log both of these things on click. So if I switch back here and I refresh the page and I come back to my console and I press click me, we're going to see both of those things logged out, which is exactly what we're telling it to do from this actual on click right here. Okay, now I want to show you something kind of cool as well. Right now we're only attaching one of these events at a time, but in Chrome and in some other browsers, if you look down here where we have styles and computed and layout, there also is an event listeners tab usually, right? And if you click on that and you have an event or an element selected that has an event attached to it, what you can see is all the list of events. So in this case, you can see that the button has a click event, and it has this handler associated to it, which is this function, which is going to run this code inside of it. So we actually can't really see the code in here, but if we were to actually give our functions a name, we should have been able to see that. We're going to get back to passive once and capturing in future videos, but keep it simple for now. If you do want to see these events, it's kind of cool to actually be seeing this event listener tab, which should be a feature in some of the more modern browsers. Okay, so I want to mention that as we're doing this, we're right now only dealing with click, right? But there are many other event types, all right? Now, I don't want to go through all the event types because I actually want to introduce that for you to look at on MDN and other websites so you can actually see what kind of events there are. And then the exercises coming up in the next video, we're going to go over a couple of those ourselves as well. But what I do want to show you is that this is an attribute right now in the actual HTML. So the question is, well, we technically saw in previous videos that we have access to these attributes in the actual objects of this element in the DOM. So let me show you what I mean. If I clear my console here, I say const button equals document.query selector, and I'm going to grab the button, right? And if I look at the button, there it is, right? Now I can do button dot, and I can access any property on this button object. So this is JavaScript, right? Check this out. We can do on, and notice when I click on, look at this list of autocompletes, right? That is a lot of different events. In fact, there's even more if you click the dot, 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 I think down here, there should be even more events as well. Now, if you do on click, right? And we press enter, you can notice that we actually have this function associated to this on click, which is totally amazing. What's really cool as well is it actually shows us that we're actually being passed a parameter or an argument in this case, right? The on click has an event that we're being passed as its clicking over here in the wrong spot, as its actual default parameter, which is super, super cool. So if I switch back over here to my code, I want to see, just for sake of example, what happens if I add another one. Let's do on, and let's do maybe on mouse enter. That might be a good one. We're going to do console.log of you have entered the button. Sounds a bit weird, but let's go with that. You can see that in this case, I have two different events associated or event handlers associated with this button, one for clicking it and one for the mouse entering this element. Okay. Now, we might need to look in detail as to what mouse over or mouse enter and all these mouse moves and different types of events actually do and what their differences between them are. But hopefully this one makes a bit of sense intuitively when you're thinking like on and then mouse enter probably is when it enters the kind of region for that button. So if I come back to my Chrome and I kind of reload the page here, watch what happens when I move my mouse over this button element. So ready? I'm going to move it closer, closer, closer. There we go. I've entered the button, right? I've entered the button, entered the button, entered the button, click the button, enter the button, right? Super fun, super fun to do. So now if I come back here and I look at the event listeners tab, you can see that I have both a click and a mouse enter event associated to this particular button that I have selected, which is pretty cool, right? So you can see button has both of these events associated to it. Great. So that is pretty useful. So we can actually now also do documents. Let me grab this right here for a second. Const button. I'm going to say button dot on mouse enter. And you can see that we have this event associated to it right here. We can do button dot on, for example, mouse down. There is no event associated to on mouse down. We have only something for click. Okay, so we can actually associate something from both sides here, from both the actual property, which will set the attribute, but as well as from the attribute, which will set the property, just like any other attribute that we saw in our previous videos when we were dealing with attributes. So that is pretty awesome. And that's what I was trying to show down here, where we can actually get this attribute to property synchronization and property to attribute synchronization in the reverse going as well, just like any other attribute. Okay, now you might be thinking, okay, well, this is kind of cool, but like, what if we want to do, a couple of different things? So maybe when we click this button, a few different things happen at one time. Now, there are a couple ways to do this. One way to do this would be instead of referring to the code directly in here, we would actually write a function to refer to. So let me show you what I mean. So let's say that instead of doing this, where I put all the code here, I want one function is going to console log meow, and maybe there's another function that console logs hello, right? So let's write that up over here. So I'm going to do a script tag, and I'm going to create a function. I'm going to call this meow, and this function is going to console.log meow. Just like that. And I'm going to do another function here, and this one is going to be hello, and this is going to console.log hello. All right, so now the question is, well, we have two functions here, so what could we do? Well, technically what we could do, as you could probably imagine, is run meow and run hello, right? So if we do that, a little bit shorter, a little bit cleaner, let's see what happens. So I'm going to come back to Chrome, reload the page. I think I have my log persistent here. But if I click on click me, you can see that it still works, right? And then our mouse enter is still running as well. So that's pretty good, but still a little bit clunky. So maybe I can say, click, or I'll say function click with probably a better name here, click log or something like that. But in here, what we can do is I can call meow and I can call hello just like that. And now what I can do is I can get rid of this and make this all work in one function call, just like that, right? This is definitely much cleaner because in order to actually understand what's happening here, we can look at the JavaScript and we don't have a bunch of random JavaScript kind of mixed in here with our actual HTML, which is really nice. In fact, in React, when we actually get to that, this is going to be a very similar pattern. You can technically write a bunch of code in these event handlers right here in line, but it's more preferable to actually write these in this fashion so that you're not just mixing a bunch of random JavaScript code inside of your markup, which is what people usually expect to see when they're seeing stuff like this. So when we actually get to that, I'll point it out again, but hopefully you can agree that this is definitely a little bit cleaner where we have one function call happening right here. And when we look at that function, we can easily see, okay, it's calling meow and it's calling hello. Meow is over here and hello is over here. And we can figure out what those mean by reading through them. So now if I come back to my Chrome and I reload the page, I should really turn off my persistent logs there, and I mouse over, we get the mouse over still. And if I click it, it's not happening. Let me see why really quick. Did I name this wrong? On click is click. Did I save it? Refresh, click. Still not happening. Happening to click. Let's see why. Let's troubleshoot it. Function click meow hello. Let's do a console.log in here. Let's just say hello. I think this has to do with hoisting and things like that. It's not running at all. I think it's because in here we have click. I'm gonna guess that this is probably a reserved word. What we're gonna do is I'll call this click button just to test this out because I'm pretty sure we shouldn't be using click. I should have probably tested this beforehand. My guess is that click was actually like a reserved special word. We shouldn't be using it, and probably is. Let's just see if this works. So click button, and I'm just going to rename that function over here, and it's going to in turn call these two. Switch back to my browser, refresh the page, and now if I click on it, there we go, meow and hello. All right. So as you can see, right, much easier to understand. We can actually follow the code much easier. And if we have a bunch of these assigned to a bunch of different elements, you can imagine that this, like, let's say that there's 20 or 30 elements on this page, it would be totally like crazy to try to read code intermingled with the actual markup. It's much easier to actually see, okay, just one function for that thing. I'm going to go and read that function if I'm interested in it. But once you end up having just huge amounts of code associated, especially if it's multiple lines or functions calling other functions in here, it gets really confusing very quickly. All right, cool. So let's take a look at one last thing to kind of wrap up this video. What you probably noticed was that as we were actually working on this, technically we can do this to call multiple functions. But if you want, there is another way to actually do this. Now, this is not usually a pattern in React, but I do want to show you this because it is very popular in the actual browser in the vanilla DOM. So if we come back here, there is this actual addEventListener that we can use on different elements inside the DOM. So for example, imagine that we have this markup over here. I've highlighted this button over here in purple and given an ID of button. Imagine I'm using query selector. You shouldn't really use IDs like this, but it is possible. But I just want to keep the code short. Now imagine that we wanted to add two different click event handlers to this button, right? We can only have one on click on the button. So really we saw one solution was that we can have an on click that calls a function that then calls two functions or three functions or however many, right? Which is definitely one solution. In fact, that's the primary solution for frameworks like React, as I mentioned. However, there is this other method as well, which is used called addEventListener. So let's take a look at how this works. We can take any element and we can call addEventListener on it, which is a method on elements in the DOM. And we can actually give it two different arguments. The first argument is the name of the event that we're listening for. Now notice there is no on over here. This is just the event itself. This is click. If I come back to the on and then the name of the event, onClick is the attribute that we use if we want to use the attribute method. On mouse over, on click, on drag, on drop, all that kind of stuff, right? But when we're using addEventListener, we're only using the name of the event without the on attached. So that's the main difference there. And then we can actually give it a function to run for that event. This way, we can actually add multiple events of the same type in a kind of a more programmatic fashion. So in this case, we're adding 2 click events to this button dynamically without actually setting the attribute for click. This is going to run both of these functions in this case that I have highlighted in pink. So let's actually test that out. So if I come back to VS Code over here, let's say that I have a function over here and this is called random. Let's say that I create a const random is equal to math.random. I should probably not name my things the same. I'll call rand. I'll do a console.log of rand, and that is this random function. All right. Now, what we can technically do is grab this button and actually attach this random to it as well on any event that we want. So in order to actually do this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this script and I'm going to paste it after the button at the end of the body, right down here. Okay, so all I did was move it from the head to the end of the body. The reason we need to do this is if I'm going to use query selector in this code, the button has to be defined before I can actually grab it from the DOM. So what I'll do down here is right after this random function call, I'm going to say document.querySelector. I'm going to grab the button and I'm going to assign this to const, let's say btn. And I'm going to say btn.addEventListener. I want to add a click event listener. And to this, I want to add the random event. All right. This is one way that we can actually call it. And the other way that we can call it is by doing btn.addEventListener. And I can say click, for example. And in here, I can actually inline the function just like this. Okay. So for here, I'll say for console.log, this is an inline dynamic function event, right? So 2 different ways. One is by declaring the function and then assigning it like this with addEventListener, which is actually the preferred method. And I'll show you why in a second. And then this is kind of the quick and dirty way to actually do it, which should also work. And again, do note that there's a lot going on in this script if I minimize it, but really we just have a button declared right over here, which has an onClick, which is calling a function in our script, and then an on mouse enter as well. But then this script just looks a little bit long because it has all of our different functions in it. Normally we would have this in a different file and we can actually use that separately so it's not cluttering up our HTML, and we'll do that in future videos. However, for now, do note that in order to actually grab an element from the DOM, it has to be defined in the actual markup first. So this script has to come after we declare our button in the body. All right, so let's head back to Chrome. I'm going to reload this page. And now what I'd like to do is click on the button. You can mouse over it, and what you'll see is you've entered the button. If I click on this, notice that 4 different functions are running. We get our original meow and hello, which are coming from the onClick attribute-based event listener. We have a random number being logged and an inline dynamic function event being logged, which are both coming from 2 dynamic functions being added using addEventListener instead of the attribute. So to show you what I mean, if I come back to this events or elements tab, what we'll see is that we have an onClick attribute and we have an on mouse enter attribute, right? OnClick is calling click button, and on mouse enter is actually running the code inline. But notice if I have the event listener tab highlighted, you'll notice that the button has 3 click events and 1 mouse enter event. These other events, right, are coming from those other 2 functions that we wrote dynamically from addEventListener. You can even see the line numbers over here, right? And we can add as many of these as we want if we need to using addEventListener for the same event. We can also just use it so that we don't clutter up our attribute space over here if we don't want it visible in the attributes, right? Now, different frameworks treat these differently. And the internal workings are kind of interesting to actually read. But do note that these are two of the primary ways to add events to these different elements, in this case to this button. You can imagine we can remove this attribute and it would remove the event, and I'll show you in a second how we could remove the ones that were added without the attribute using addEventListener. Okay, wonderful. Now I'm going to come back here and I want to show you something kind of interesting. You probably noticed that when I did this over here on line 34, what I didn't do was call random here. Okay. Now I want to mention this since this is a pretty common source of confusion, both for attributes and adding event listeners dynamically. I'm going to read this line to you kind of as best as I can in plain English. So we're saying, grab the button element and add an event listener to it dynamically for the click event. Now, what event or what function do I want you to call when you actually get a click event? I want you to go and find the random function and call it for me. So here, the addEventListener syntax is going to take a handle to a function to call. It's not going to expect the function to be called in line, which is what we're doing right here. But what we're doing here is calling the random function and grabbing the result and passing it to addEventListener, which in this case would be undefined since we're not returning anything from random, right? So technically, what this is actually doing is this, if you think about it, which is not what we want to do. We actually want to pass the handle to random so that addEventListener, when it gets the click event, can actually go and call this function for us. The difference between this method and the actual attribute method is that here we do call it. Okay, so for the attribute method, we actually put the code as if we were going to execute it, because the entire string basically gets evaluated at once. That's the main difference between the attribute version of events and the addEventListener version of events. So the addEventListener, we pass it a function to call without calling the function, same as this example here, line 35 to 37, or this one on 34, just with the named function. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. So to finish off this video, I want to show you removing an event listener. Now this is pretty tricky and really important to kind of keep in mind as you build larger and larger scale applications. It turns out you've probably all used applications where it kind of gets slower over time with the more that you use it. There's many reasons for this, but one potential reason for this is that events always, these event listeners, keep getting added to the DOM, but never actually freed up or removed. So the more that we click on things, scroll around and move things around, the more code gets added to this thread for JavaScript, and the harder and clunkier it gets, to the point eventually where it might just crash. So what we want to do is, if we're no longer interested in an event, we actually want to remove it from the DOM to free up some code space in memory. Now, this is a bit tricky because the way that this function works is it expects an actual handle to the function instead of a copy of the function. So let me show you what I mean. Traditionally, a lot of people will add an event listener like this, which is the second version that I showed you. We can, in this case, add the click event to our button, and we're going to pass it an anonymous function right here that says, you clicked me. Now, to remove an event, we pass it the same function that we added. So in theory, we could do button.removeEventListener, pass it the same event that we were listening on, click, and then the same function. Oops, moving it all over around. But this is actually not going to work because these two ping functions right here, the one in the add and the one in the remove from up here, are actually two different functions. They are not the same function. The function up here when we're adding is actually its own function that's created when we're adding, and then this function down here when we're removing is another function that is added when it is being removed. And they just happen to have the same code in this case, but they are different functions in memory. So this will actually not work. So what will work is this down here, which is why I said it was the preferred method earlier. If we declare a function like click, for example, that has a name and points to a single function, then we can add that to any amount of elements that we want, and then we can actually remove it using the same handle to the original function. So here we are adding a click event and we are adding the click function to be called, which is up here, and we can remove it using the same click event and the same function handle to this function. I'm too excited with my clicking up here, which is this click function right here, right? So these two pink clicks are referring to this function, but these two pink clicks up here are referring to different functions that actually happen to have the same code inside of it. And we covered this previously when we studied JavaScript, when we looked at how functions work a little bit behind the scenes. However, do keep this in mind, because if you don't remove functions when you expect them to be removed, potentially what you can be doing is introducing memory leaks into your actual program, where you accidentally keep adding event listeners and never removing them, to the point where potentially if it's open for a long time, it might actually cause some bugs and slowdowns in your application. All right, I hope that this video was valuable for you and interesting. If it was, I would love it if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel. What we're gonna do in the next video is go over a bunch of exercises with this concept to get kind of a better handle, and no pun intended, on how these event listeners actually work. And just a bit more practice really helps to really solidify this idea, since it's so important and central to JavaScript. And then following that, we're going to go over these ideas of bubbling and capturing, as well as a fancy idea of event delegation, so we can actually be really careful and cognizant of how many event listeners we're adding to the DOM at once, depending on what kind of functionality we want to add. I will actually see you in those exercise videos where we go over a few of those. I'll see you in the next one. See you later.